A first-century carpenter stood before a crowd of uneducated farmers in the Middle East and delivered a series of teachings. Over the next 2,000 years, those ideas ignited a chain reaction that would construct the legal systems, the scientific institutions, and the moral baseline of modern Western civilization. The first-century status quo was defined by Roman occupation. The Jewish people were living under a crushing military presence, and their primary hope was for a warrior messiah, a leader who would lead a violent rebellion and physically conquer their enemies. Others sought salvation through the religious system of the Pharisees, where worth was measured by how rigidly a person followed hundreds of external rules and rituals. For them, purity was a matter of total adherence to ancient code. Jesus radically subverted both of these groups. He raised no army. He drafted no political manifesto. Instead, he went up on a hillside and delivered the Sermon on the Mount, instructing his followers to turn the other cheek, to bless their persecutors, and to love their enemies. He located the kingdom of God within the human heart. By defining his movement through internal conviction rather than physical borders or geopolitical power, he initiated a shift in human allegiance that bypassed the traditional levers of authority. Jesus claimed he had come to fulfill the ancient laws by resetting the metric for righteousness. In this new framework, heart-level motivation carried the primary moral weight. Private anger was viewed with the same gravity as physical violence. The behavioral core of this kingdom was a radical command to love both neighbor and enemy with the same unselfish intensity. He described this system using the imagery of a vine and branches. Followers accessed the vine's power by keeping the new commandment to love. This opened the conduit to the main power source, producing fruit, resilient, loving communities that supported one another. True obedience in this framework is never achieved through isolated legalism. It requires maintaining an open connection of grace toward others. This relational logic moves from abstract theology to a practical testing ground in our closest relationships. Marriages and families function as a crucible where these ideas are forced to perform under the pressure of daily life. Chronic interpersonal differences act as a pruning mechanism. The friction of living with someone else's flaws forces an individual to confront their own selfishness, impatience, and need for control. When Peter betrayed Jesus on the night of his arrest, Jesus didn't respond with condemnation. He sought Peter out later and offered full restoration. Prioritizing this kind of connection over the desire to be right forces the ego to surrender and initiates genuine change. This grueling work of managing interpersonal differences with grace is the primary engine of personal growth. It builds a character that solitude cannot produce. What happens when millions of individuals apply this relational logic to their lives over the course of 20 centuries? It establishes a civilizational operating system based on the Imago Dei, the belief that every individual is created in the image of God. This assigned infinite divine value to every human being, regardless of their social rank. This conviction provided the moral logic for the fight for human equality and the abolition of slavery. It became the intellectual anchor for democratic rights, which rely on the assumption that every person possesses inherent dignity. The mandate to heal the broken and care for the vulnerable led directly to the historical foundation of modern healthcare. Early religious orders institutionalized the act of care, turning the command to love into the physical architecture of a hospital. The specific instruction to practice sacrificial, unconditional charity created the global infrastructure for social services. Organizations like the Red Cross and the Salvation Army were founded to turn this religious duty into large-scale relief efforts. Even the scientific revolution was driven by the belief in a rational, loving creator whose world was governed by discoverable laws. This commitment to truth and knowledge led to the establishment of the world's first universities, such as Oxford and Cambridge. These major institutions of the West grew from the accumulated actions of individuals choosing to treat the person right in front of them as though they possessed infinite value. History suggests that the most effective force for changing the world is not military might or political dominance. It is the quiet, radical practice of extending grace to one another. Most of us treat certain concepts as if they are part of the atmosphere. We assume that every human being is born equal, that slavery is an objective evil, and that education is a right that belongs to everyone. We tend to view these progressive values as the natural endpoint of human progress, the inevitable result of a society becoming more rational over time. But across the vast majority of recorded history, the exact opposite was true. For thousands of years, rigid hierarchy and systemic inequality were viewed as the natural order of the world. Consider Aristotle, one of history's most influential thinkers, argued that some people are marked for subjection from the moment of their birth. To him, the relationship of the superior to the inferior, of the master to the slave, was a fact of biology. This wasn't an outlier opinion. For millennia, ancient societies rarely even bothered to justify slavery or social castes. They simply accepted them as observable realities of the human condition. If hierarchy and subjugation were the undisputed defaults for thousands of years, what specific shift in thinking rewired the Western mind to believe in human equality? The source of this change tracks back to a specific theological framework found in early Jewish and Christian thought. It centers on the concept of imago Dei, or the image of God. This introduced the idea that every human being is a moral agent endowed with inherent dignity by their creator. We see this put into practice in early Christian monasteries, which functioned as egalitarian social orders where peasants and former elites worked as spiritual equals. While social practices often lagged behind for centuries, the introduction of this concept created a permanent tension in the aristocratic world. It provided a moral baseline that, over a long process of evolution, began to challenge the very idea of a natural hierarchy. By the 16th century, this idea reached a new turning point during the Reformation. Martin Luther began advocating for the priesthood of all believers. His argument was logistical. If every person is spiritually equal and responsible for their own soul, then every person must be able to read the scriptures for themselves. This religious requirement drove the push for universal literacy. In 1647, the Massachusetts colony passed the Old Deluder Satan Act, the first law in America requiring mass education. Its stated goal was to ensure citizens could read the Bible to avoid being deceived by ignorance. This spiritual mandate had global consequences. Missionaries often performed the first scientific studies of unwritten languages, creating alphabets and dictionaries specifically so people could read the biblical text. The American university system was built on this same foundation. Of the first 138 colleges founded in America, including institutions like Yale and Harvard, over 90% were established to serve this religious movement and its focus on truth-seeking. Our modern public school systems have deep roots in this period. Long before it became a secular ideal, universal education was viewed as a spiritual necessity. This excavation moves from the classroom into the development of modern law and governance. In the Middle Ages, the development of canon law became the first legal system in the West to assume moral equality before the law, a direct outgrowth of the belief that every soul carried equal weight. Centuries later, Enlightenment thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke began formulating the rules for the modern state. These thinkers secularized inherited moral assumptions. Shifting away from theology, they retained the belief in human agency to build classical liberalism. For example, John Locke argued for religious freedom. Because all people are equally God's creatures, the state must administer justice impartially, without playing favorites. Through a long process of cultural evolution, our modern concepts of political liberty and human rights grew out of this theological bedrock, eventually shedding their religious language while keeping their moral core. Today, we live in a society that prides itself on being secular and rational. We view our egalitarian values as purely modern achievements. But historians note a strange paradox. The modern West has largely discarded its past religious beliefs, yet it continues to rely on the specific theory of human worth that those beliefs created. We cannot fully understand the modern Western mind without looking at what it rests upon. Its entire architecture is built on a radical, ancient premise: the inescapable dignity